Thanks for joining today, and thank you, Patricia. We've just been a part of a historic weekend of millions expressing their patriotism and love of America. But how did we get to a place where we have to march in the streets to protest authoritarianism in the United States? Simply put, there was and still is a sustained investment in changing the culture of our country, defining for people what is happening to them, and ultimately impacting voter choices. There was and is an unholy alliance among those who were against civil rights advancements, regulations to rein in corporate excesses, the accumulation of unimagined wealth, and a goal of destroying the public sector. There has been an unrelenting effort to discredit and vilify the very idea of government. So this message was advanced through a series of think tanks, a media ecosystem, advocacy campaigns, legal organizations, and billionaire-supported grassroots organizations. This was the predicate needed to elect candidates intent on crippling the public sector by lowering taxes and hindering regulations that stood in the way of corporate greed. While this was going on, the ability of everyday Americans to support themselves and their families was eroding through globalization, wage stagnation, and the loss of jobs as the economy moved from manufacturing to a service and financial-based one. So at times of extreme financial insecurity and growing income inequality, leaders who promise just to fix it or promise stability become increasingly attractive. There have been four major avenues aiding increasing authoritarianism. The first is othering and fostering division. This has been the tool in their toolbox. The erosion of trust in our institutions, distortions of truth and what is and is not factual, and the strengthening of religious and nationalist movements that legitimize authoritarian rule as a moral imperative. So as we look forward to 2026, elections are important and we must elect candidates who share our values. But that is not enough. We must also address the underlying dynamics that are creating a country we don't recognize. This is where our ability to understand the impact of culture and how to shape it become paramount. Now, let's turn it to Erica.
Thanks so much, Paige, for that introduction and that framing of today's conversation, and frankly, for that framing of the moment that we're in and how we got here. As Paige said, culture is such a critical part of, it is really the air that we breathe, and the air that we have been breathing for quite a long time has led us to this point. So I'm excited to have a conversation today with three really interesting, brilliant folks who are coming at this challenge and this opportunity really that is in front of us from various perspectives. Omar Parbhoo, whom many of you may have heard Paige talk about before on here as we've talked about innovating for the public good. Omar is the new CEO of Innovating and has been thinking a lot strategically about how do we find the ideas that are going to actually help us get from here to the country that we want to see. And so he's going to share a little bit about that strategy and in particular how that strategy intersects with the cultural change and the narrative shifts that we are hoping to see. And then we're going to turn the conversation over to Mathew Littman and Dori Howard, who have been running for quite some time an agency, but also I'd say kind of a collective and a movement in popular culture and in Hollywood to think about how some of these narratives are moved forward as well. And so it's going to be a really interesting conversation. I'm looking forward to hearing what they're doing. And I guess the one thing that I'd like to kind of put on the table before we begin and before I turn to Omar is that oftentimes on our side and in our movements, when we've talked about culture shift, we've thought of it in kind of very limited ways, and in some cases, very surface ways. We've thought about kind of key issue campaigns, which I would say arguably we've been very effective at doing and at shifting. But the challenge we have before us right now requires both that and also a deeper thinking and a deeper strategy around the core values and the narratives that are shaping who we are and how we see one another. And so I'm really interested in hearing from you, and I know your strategy's been thinking a lot about what those core areas are. And so I'm going to turn it over first to Omar to share with us a little bit about what he's working on and his perspective of the landscape at Innovating.
Great. Thank you, Erica. And thanks all of you for being here. Appreciate everyone joining today. And as Erica mentioned, I lead Innovating for the Public Good, which in essence is an R&D lab for democracy. We exist to develop solutions for the biggest civic challenges our democracy is facing right now. And I know when we talk about democracy, we often think of a political system, a set of laws, elections, and institutions. But in truth, if I can quote Andrew Breitbart, politics is downstream of culture. Culture shapes what we think is legitimate, who we see as part of quote unquote us, and what kind of future we believe we're capable of building together. So when democracy falters, it's not just a policy failure, it's a cultural one. So I love that this conversation is looking at culture from different angles, especially movies, which I always enjoy, because the stories we tell, the examples we see, and the way we imagine community is where democracy either takes root or erodes. So the real crisis today isn't just polarization or authoritarian backsliding. I know it looms over us, but it's really a deeper erosion of our civic culture. And it shows up in multiple ways, including how we see each other, where we place our trust, and whether we believe the democratic project is still worth participating in. Across the country, we've lost a shared sense of purpose. People increasingly view those on the other side as a threat rather than fellow citizens. Our differences have been turned into divisions, and our divisions have been turned into identities. And us versus them mentality has become pervasive. And unfortunately, our political leaders are an accelerant. Relatedly, we lost a shared sense of truth. Paige alluded to some of these problems. For many people, who they believe and who they trust is now grounded in a tight, homogenous network. Friends, media, online groups that confirm what we already believe. The result is a world where even basic facts are contested and where cynicism often feels safer than faith in one another. So taken together, all of this is understandably leading to a growing number of Americans across the political spectrum doubting that democracy can deliver. Many see participation as futile, institutions as corrupt, and compromise as unnecessary. But these aren't random trends. They've been cultivated. Again, Paige touched on this, reinforced by decades of work and also by our social media platforms that reward outrage, by the political incentives in place that weaponize grievance, and by an economy that isolates people from one another. Again, Paige talked about the Decades Project. We didn't arrive at this point overnight. And like I said, we aren't here by accident. As many of you know, for decades, people intent on concentrating power have played the long game. Some of you may recognize what's on the screen here. It's the Powell Memo from 1971 that became a blueprint for protecting corporate interests and much more. This type of thinking inspired a relatively small group of people to invest in shaping narratives, distorting politics, and building a media ecosystem that normalized their worldview. But I want to stress that we can't treat the current state of affairs as a fait accompli. Now imagine what it would look like to reclaim that power, but in service of a thriving, inclusive democracy, a society where divisions are replaced with a sense of shared belonging, collective responsibility is valued alongside individual rights, and people believe that they have the power to shape the world around them. Culture isn't just something that happens to us, it's something we shape. And that's what IFPG and others like Howlitt are working to do. So from the IFPG perspective, we're building the infrastructure for a democratic culture that's resilient, inclusive, and self-renewing. And to do that, we're focused on tackling 3 foundational forces head on. These forces are othering, fatalism, and hyper-individualism. Othering fuels zero-sum thinking that turns neighbors into adversaries. Fatalism convinces people that the system is rigged and nothing they will do will make a difference, so why not tear it down? And hyper-individualism leaves people isolated, believing problems are theirs alone to solve. These forces feed disconnection, distrust, and disengagement. Until we start chipping away at these forces, even the best efforts to renew our democracy will fail to add up to durable change. I want to bring this point home through this table here. I've mapped out how these forces are contributing to some of the recent issues we've been experiencing. We can draw a very clear line from othering, fatalism, and hyper-individualism to things like anti-immigrant fervor, or low voter turnout, or attacks on DEI. When we understand and reverse these trends, we then start building the conditions for a pluralistic democracy that people actively support and participate in. At IFPG, our model does 2 things. We first unpack and spotlight the upstream challenges that need to be addressed. And second, we cultivate an environment of innovation where we can take big swings to address those challenges. We need big swings right now because these are large, sticky problems. But also, the threats to our democracy are evolving and worsening rapidly these days. The old playbooks alone aren't enough. We need solutions that are just as big and dynamic as the challenges we face. So to do that properly, we recognize that we need to treat culture itself as a civic infrastructure. We need to innovate, to find solutions that can make people less susceptible to the forces that are laid out here. We're doing that by casting a wide net to look at ideas from every sector so we can identify novel solutions, prototype and test them, and finally scale what works. So I have limited time, so let me just highlight some work we're already doing to deepen our understanding of some of these core challenges. So here you see some research we recently conducted to map out the mechanics of othering. Along with Hart Research and PSG Consulting, we surveyed almost 2,700 registered voters to directly understand how people view themselves relative to others and what's driving divisions, but also what's potentially uniting us. We were able to quantify, if I have to be honest, a pretty grim picture. Across the board, voters felt like their in-group was losing power. You would imagine that if this were based on objective reality, you'd see winners and losers. But in the rhetoric of our politics today, everyone is casting themselves as the aggrieved. But there are some pockets of hope. When we dig deeper, we see generational differences that suggest the narrative of othering doesn't land equally with everybody. Younger voters are far less likely to buy into ideas that pit groups against one another. Instead, they're much more focused on issues like racial justice, immigrant rights, and women's equality. We also see a similar story playing out with Trump's deportation agenda. Outside of his base, support collapses. And among young voters, it's overwhelmingly rejected. These data tell us that the appeal of othering has limits. Without a doubt, rhetoric is potent when amplified, but it's also fragile when confronted with values of fairness, inclusion, and belonging. Seeing what's happening today on the ground is putting people in a place where they are having their values challenged by what they're experiencing in their communities, seeing on their screens, and forcing them to recast their understanding of the policies of this moment and whether they want to be in an experiment of division or working together. We can figure out how to leverage that. We need to figure out how to leverage all of those opportunities without exacerbating the rhetoric, and that's the trick. But it's a foundation that I believe we could build on. So let me stop there in the interest of time and pass it back to Erica.
Thanks so much, Omar. I have a lot of thoughts, a lot of questions, but let's shift over to Matt and Dori to kind of talk a little bit about what that looks like or what that has been looking like in practice, as well as just their thoughts around how we shift culture given that context and that kind of perspective. So Matt and Dori, and then I will ask some questions of all of you, but also just want to remind those who are watching that you can throughout submit questions through the Q&A. And I already see some in there, but submit some questions through the Q&A and we'll make sure to incorporate those in the conversation. Okay, Matt and Dori, take it away.
Hi, thank you all so much for having us. Matt and I are really excited to be here and to talk about how a shift in cultural and structural forces shape policy and politics. We started our agency working specifically in the intersection of Hollywood and politics. We weren't liking what we were seeing out there in terms of how Hollywood writers, actors, producers, directors were being leveraged to get the results we wanted in these elections. And we came up with some interesting ways to try things a little bit differently. These are a bunch of the clients that we work with. We'll get into some very specific examples of the work we do with them as we give you an overview of how we believe culture should be changing culture. This is one of my favorite quotes. It's a great artist, Jenny Holzer. And she talks about using what is dominant in culture to change it quickly. And that's what we are endeavoring to do.
Thanks, Dori. So many of you, I'm sure all of you have heard the phrase designated driver. You may have been a designated driver a couple of times yourselves. It's important to note that that phrase was created by the entertainment industry and a professor from Harvard in the 1980s. So when the drunk driving was basically at its peak, they started adding the term designated driver into TV shows. And when they did that, 3 years later, drunk driving deaths were down 30%, and designated driver became a term in the dictionary. So it serves as a great example of the power of using culture to change culture.
We saw that also in 2012 in an interview on Meet the Press. Joe Biden was at the time made history as the highest electing official to go on the record supporting gay marriage. And he said that he believed a big part of the changing perception of our country was due to will and grace. And one of my favorite examples, because we talk a lot about nuclear policy, is in 1983, there was a made-for-TV movie called The Day After, and it was at a different time. So half of American adults were watching this movie, and the simple storyline is there's a nuclear attack in Lawrence, Kansas, which is smack dab in the middle of the country. Well, it was one of those water cooler moments in America when everyone was talking about this film, including Ronald and Nancy Reagan, who watched it the night before Thanksgiving when it aired, and their diary entries from Reagan talking about how that film and seeing the aftermath of what the citizens were going through affected how he thought about nuclear policy. And there's so many more examples of this. I'm going to run you through 3 more simply because my mom is on this webinar and I really want to justify all the television I watched as a child and how it's actually helping me as a grown-up. But after Top Gun, a 500% increase of Navy recruits. Teen Mom, that terrible series on MTV, had incredible effects, 5.6 decrease in teen births. And the Barbie movie from 2 summers ago, 150% increase in searching OBGYN.
And then before we even get to that, a couple of other good examples from how the entertainment industry has affected society. So smoking, for example, has dropped in half since the early 2000s. Part of that was the entertainment industry took on smoking in the early 2000s, and mostly, not always, and it's making a bit of a comeback, unfortunately, but mostly when you see smoking on screen, it's a villain, a period piece, a flashback. So smoking has dropped in half. Seatbelts were at about 11% in 1980. They're at about 92% now. So if you go back and watch an old TV show or a movie, you'll see people getting in their cars, they don't put on their seatbelts. But if you watch, Dori, we already have Barbie on the screen. If you watch Barbie, for example, and Barbie gets into the back of a car, in the Barbie movie, she puts on a seatbelt, right? Idris Elba, when he gets into a cab on some type of talk show, he puts on a seatbelt. It's not the story. They're just showing it. And what happens is when people see it, they see that as being normalized and they start to do it, not even realizing that they've seen it happen on their screens. So Dori, for this, so strategic mobilization for a cultural storyteller. So Dori listed a bunch of our work clients before. And one thing that we also do, and we've been doing for a few years, a couple of you are on here know about and have been a part of it. And in 2020, at the behest of the Biden campaign, so he was then becoming the nominee for president, not quite yet the nominee, we started what we call the Entertainment Industry Working Group, which now consists of about 400 cultural leaders who are on an email exchange, but also we have Zooms. We started doing Zooms once a week during the initial Biden campaign in 2020. So if we start out, for example, with Tony Blinken, who went on to be Secretary of State, and Valerie Biden Owens were our first guests. And we would have these meetings and basically people would say what they need. And we would try to provide what they need voluntarily. So at that time, 2020, campaign would say something like, we have an event in Michigan, we're not raising enough money. Can we get a named person to host that event? So we would do that. We did something called Celebrity Zoom Bombs that you may have seen, which were where everybody was on Zoom in 2020 because of COVID. So let's say the Pennsylvania volunteers for the Biden campaign were on a Zoom. We would have Justin Timberlake show up on the Zoom to thank them. We'd have the editors of Parks and Rec edit the video and the campaign would put it up on the website. It became very popular. A bunch of things like that. Campaign ends in 2020. We then go on to do that instead of weekly, monthly. And we have on leaders from all around the country, newsmakers, come on our Zooms. Our Zooms could have anywhere on our end from 25 to 100 people because they're on in the middle of the day. So we never know who's going to come on or who's working and can't come on our end. And the reason the Zooms are successful is because we have 2 rules. No complaining. How can I be helpful? So now as Democrats, I think a lot of you are, we have a lot to complain about right now. And on our Zooms, if we have on a Democratic leader, we don't say, you're doing this wrong. Why are you doing this? We say, How can we be helpful to you to do this, right? And it's also a way for us to get firsthand information from people without going through a filter of the news. So we did a lot for the Biden campaign in 24, as well as the Harris campaign. People in our group create ads for members of Congress, do messaging for members of Congress and candidates, host fundraisers. The picture that Dori showed earlier of a bunch of us surrounding Gretchen Whitmer was a bunch of us went on the bus in Michigan with Gretchen Whitmer and Jocelyn Benson. A lot of people in our group really love Jocelyn Benson, who's running for governor of Michigan, and are very involved in that campaign. So we have on Gavin Newsom, for example, the governor of California came on a couple of weeks ago, and that was great. He motivated people and talked about Prop 50. As you know, that's the redistricting ballot measure here in California that's coming up for a vote in a couple of weeks. So we got a lot of people involved. And so recently we've even added a bunch of influencer types, a bunch of political influencer types that we're not paying. I want to make that important point. We don't pay them to come on, and they are able to make relationships, have relationships through our Zooms and get involved in projects through our Zooms. Now there are many other examples. So for example, in the Harris campaign, we formed a great group of comedians. This was the best writers group in human history. Top comedians, top comedy writers. That group continues on its own, and we'll show you some examples of their work in a minute. Oh, we'll show you that right now. So this is in Washington today, and this is going to be all around Washington. That's Stephen Miller, and those lines under him are. We go out to our group and we say, "Can you give us this?" And they come back with stuff. We just did it yesterday again for somebody else. And when I say these are the household name comedians and the people who did some of the greatest shows on television, and they voluntarily do this. There are many issues where we go to the group and say, we need some ideas. Can we put a writers group together, for example? And so we've worked on this messaging with our leaders on a voluntary basis. A leader will go on Stephen Colbert and say, I need some jokes for Colbert. We go to our group. That's on the comedy side. There's plenty in other areas as well that group continues to do. So for example, we have Stacey Abrams coming up. We have Jasmine Crockett coming up. And that group continues. We also try to elevate leaders like Mayor Aftab in Cincinnati, who a lot of people in the cultural space wouldn't know, but we want them to know. Mayor Michelle Wu from Boston is another great example. Didn't know much about her. She came on. She blew everybody away. She was absolutely fantastic. And that helps her garner support from people who might not otherwise know who she is. We brought on abortion rights groups, environmental groups, immigration groups, so that people in our space can figure out how to support those groups.
And so I want to give you a few examples of the work that we're actively doing right now. And I should say these images, these fabulous images of Stephen Miller, and Matt pointed this out, these went up in DC this weekend for the No Kings rallies, and they're going to be all over the city, and they're going to continue on. But here's another example of the work that we do with our clients. This is a still from a film that is out right now. It's called House of Dynamite. It's going to be on Netflix, I think, next week. It's an incredible movie. Everyone should see it. So the Nuclear Threat Initiative is one of our clients. And what we do is get them involved with content that is being created around nuclear weapons. And we do it right from the very, very beginning when these projects are being developed through the very end when we try and amplify their distribution and get more people to be talking about them and watching them. So our client got a very early look at the script and read the script and gave notes to Catherine Bigelow, who is the director, and Noah Oppenheim, who is the writer. And originally, and I'm not giving anything away, but there's a slight plot point where in the film, you don't see the origin point of the missile that is shot. And that was a note that came from the Nuclear Threat Initiative. And the reason we suggested that is because, as Rebecca Ferguson, the star of the film, says, there's no single baddie in the film. The baddie is the system. And that was a really important point to get people talking about the perils of nuclear weapons, is that it's taking the focus off China, North Korea, Russia, and really putting the focus on the missiles. And by getting that message into the movie, we were able to shift the conversation around it. We also are able to get more people talking about the dangers of nuclear weapons by using these stalwarts of the entertainment industry like James Cameron here. So there's a book that came out this summer called Ghosts of Hiroshima. This is James Cameron's next film he's doing, and it's going to be his first non-Avatar film since Titanic. So people are excited for it. And it tells the stories of the double survivors of both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So we wanted to get more people talking about the 80th anniversary of those bombings that happened this summer. And the way we were able to do that is we did a 1 hour webinar, not webinar, we did a 1 hour live stream on YouTube with Jim, Secretary Moniz, who's the CEO of the Nuclear Threat Initiative, and Christian Amanpour. Working with a filmmaker of Cameron's stature was a wild ride. As I was working with his manager, and at one point when he was calling me every night at all hours, Jim was in New Zealand and Christian was in England, and they gave us literally a 1 hour window of his time on a Sunday night, and it was a very logistically challenging thing to pull off, to say the least. But his manager said to me, "This will be a horrible process to get this done, but the end result will be spectacular." And I'll say both sides lived up to their promise. And the conversation we were able to produce between these three on YouTube was so fantastic. CNN actually lifted 20 minutes of it directly and aired it on CNN International. And again, it's getting coverage of nuclear weapons from a different point of view, from a filmmaker and a creative point of view, that gets the public talking.
Right. So we work for Brady, which is a fantastic organization. I should say that there are a lot of great gun reform organizations. We work for Brady, absolutely great. And this program is called Show Gun Safety. So Show Gun Safety for Brady is a program where we go into writers' rooms, studios, streamers, agencies, talent agencies, management firms, and we talk about just this, showing gun safety. In other words, there are 400 million guns in the United States. We know that that's the case. Entertainment industry is not going to stop showing guns. So what can they do? Things are obviously difficult in DC in terms of getting anything done. Culture really matters here now, maybe more than ever, right? So what we do is we go in and we say, show guns in safes. Don't show kids with guns. Show repercussions of gun violence, right? So guns are the number one killer of kids in the United States. They've been the number one killer of Black kids in the United States since 2005. What can we do to make a change here? We talked earlier about the things that culture has done. Dori, for example, talked about gay marriage, talked about the day after nuclear weapons. We talked about the designated driver example, right? So what can we do? So if you show guns in safes on television and movies, people see that and they start to do it. So 54% of new gun owners, for example, secure their guns securely, but that means that a lot of people do not, right? And if you look on any single day, and I don't want you to do this, but if you did, for example, right now, you would look online and type in kids' guns, accidental shooting, or something like that, and some horror story would come up, like true story, 7-year-old, 2-year-old in their mom's truck. Mom leaves the gun in a plastic bag in the car. One kid shoots the other kid. Somebody leaves the gun out on the counter. 3-year-old picks up the gun, shoots the mom in the head. These things happen way too often. There is a way for this to happen less often, right? 58% of gun deaths are suicides. Sometimes it's taking somebody else's gun that causes that. 76% of school shooters take their gun from the home. 49% of those are unlocked or unstored. There are ways to make this not go away, but to lessen it. And when you lessen it, it saves lives. So going into those rooms is not something that you could do on every issue, because writers truly don't want to be told what to do. So we definitely don't do that. We do this for the Nuclear Threat Initiative and some other projects as well. But I don't do this as much as I do for Brady, which is very often every couple of weeks. So as examples, we went into the new Spider-Man movie. We just went into NCIS. We went into the show Cross, which takes place in DC. It's filmed mostly in Toronto, I'm sorry to say, but it takes place in DC. And in that show, for example, Cross is a detective, right? What are the gun laws in DC? How do the gun laws differ from DC to Maryland and Virginia? Those are things that we go in and we discuss with them when we're in there. So we sit in a writer's room. If you don't know, it has like a table, and sometimes there could be 4 people, and sometimes there could be 14 people. So we make this presentation. We talk about what Hollywood used to do. So we show examples, for example, of Sharon Stone smoking in Basic Instinct, Cary Grant and Ingrid Bergman happily driving drunk in an Alfred Hitchcock movie. And we talk about how things have changed over time and how things need to change now. And then we finish by showing examples of Hollywood showing gun safety. which is that since we've been doing this, there are a lot of shows now where you see somebody putting a gun in a safe. And it doesn't mean that you could always do it. You know, if you're watching an action show and somebody jumps through the glass ceiling, we realize you're not taking the gun out of the safe. Okay. But if you're in your car or your house or your office, you could take your gun out of a safe very easily, and it doesn't do anything to the story. So we've been going around. We have a deal with CBS Studios. We have a deal with Disney. And we go around to a lot of these shows and we talk all the time about showing gun safety. It has a very positive response from the community. This is a Boston Globe piece by a gun owner talking about how much she likes this program because we're not asking for a major change, don't show guns. She's saying this is a small change. CNN did a similar piece on this program as well. I would venture to say that it's been a big success for Brady so far. Dori, are we going to talk about the fundraising part after?
Or right here.
Okay.
That's perfect. I want to hear about that part, and then we've got so many questions for you all. So keep going.
Okay, Nat. So wait, Nat. So end on this, and then also talk about in the short time we have left, the TED talk you did at the House Dems retreat.
Okay, so
and then we'll wrap it up. I promise.
Okay, so on this one, do we have another 3 hours, Erica, or we can?
Absolutely, with me.
I told you we go
No.
So the picture of this is looks like a comedian talking to an audience, and that's on purpose, because for Brady in January we'll be doing a comedy event in Los Angeles at a comedy club, where we'll be doing Dori and I do fundraising for Brady. So we're not normally fundraisers, but we've taken to this. And we love the organization so much that we're starting to do these fundraisers for Brady. We do other things for Brady as well. We're trying to get Brady into the schools through their youth program called Team Enough, which we've been doing now as well. But this is a picture of a comedian in front of an audience. We don't know yet who's headlining that event, but we have incredible people helping us, like Jill Liederman, who produced Kimmel and Letterman, is in charge of this event basically for us. And they do that because they care and because people in town want to know how they could be helpful. Right? How can we help? This is a terrible, terrible time. What can we do to be helpful? So Dori and I try to put them to work, and we have a phrase that we use a lot, which is we don't tell people to do stupid shit. Right? There are a lot of people, a lot of ways, as you well know, that the entertainment industry, cultural leaders can be used the wrong way. You've seen it many times. We are very, very careful about what causes, what campaigns we ask people to get involved in. So we do that. Dori's referring to in this, I don't even remember what it was, the spring. I gave a TED style talk at the House Issues Retreat in Virginia to talk about messaging, and not to say what the message should be, but to say where it should be and how to do it, to talk more about the fact that 6,000 newspapers have closed since the early 2000s. You need to be on social media. And obviously, somebody like Congressman Swalwell or Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez does not need to hear that from me. But there are plenty of people who didn't do that. There are still some who don't do that. And I see all the time these things about how we need to, Chris Hayes had a good article yesterday, maybe it's today in the New York Times, about how we need to flood the zone on messaging. Just be constant. Don't worry about if you say the wrong thing, that's okay. And that was what part of the conversation was with the House Democrats.
And Erica, the good news is we are now done.
I mean, it's good because people want to talk, but it was a fantastic presentation. Thank you for sharing. Culture change work excites me. I've been doing it for quite a while, along with narrative change. And so I have a lot of questions for you. Some from the audience, but also just some to kind of put this in context, because I think I'm going to step out on a limb here and say a lot of folks understand kind of in an abstract way that culture change is important. But then there are questions about how do we do it?
Right.
How do we do it effectively? How do we convince other people, particularly people who have dollars and can make this stuff happen, that is important? So I want to kind of jump into, I think everyone's made an effective case, first of all, that it is important. But how do we do this? And a lot of the questions I think are around that. So question one I'll ask for you is, you know, a lot of the impact that we talk about, some of the examples that you all gave, Opportunity Agenda did a great report a couple of years ago too, listing those, including death penalty, including animal rights. Like there's some really groundbreaking examples of how our side has effectively shifted culture towards progressive issues. But the assessment of that takes a long time, right? So even with something like the Brady work that you all are doing, it's not going to be overnight. Like we're not going to shift gun culture overnight. How do you all, and I'll ask you this as well, Omar, when you're thinking about some of the larger kind of fundamental value shifts you're hoping to create, how do you assess what's working? What are the indicators in culture or in kind of literally specifically with your work that say, yeah, this is having the effect it's supposed to have. This is reaching the people we want it to reach. This is changing hearts and minds the way we hope it will.
Can
So
I
we
just,
do-
sorry,
yeah.
I just want to make a point which relates to your question, which is one of the measurements of success is when culture creates demand. And the demand then, trickles down to public policy or elected officials. And so you see a different mindset and it's politically in their interest to hear, what the demand is and to respond to it. And so I think part of the success is how do you create through culture a demand for change?
So I think if you look at the example that Dori gave, that going back the day after, right? That's a great example where as Dori said, half the country watched the day, half the adults of the country watched the day after. The president at that time himself made a change in the way that he viewed nuclear weapons. I mean, that is a fantastic example of how culture affects society. When we talk about, for us on the gun issue, a lot of it is when we go into these rooms and people say they're going to show gun safes, right? When we get those responses at a TV show, I don't want to name it, fine, NCIS, they said that they didn't know that they didn't really know about gun safes, right? They didn't really know. They had never thought about it. There are many shows that we go into where we talk about this and they say, I had not even thought about that. And one thing I will say about writers and producers is they don't want to be caught short knowledge wise. They don't want to be taught what to do, but they don't want it to be that they didn't know. So it's very difficult. A very difficult thing that we are able to do is to get into those rooms. Everybody wants to get into those rooms for their cause. Mostly they can't. So getting in shows interest by itself. So then you have to phrase this in a way that they want to be interested in what you're selling. You have to have the credibility that they know you're bringing in something good and meaningful. And it doesn't always mean, by the way, that you get the response that you want. But as a response that you want, in terms of how we see it in society, Erica, using that question as an example, there's a new Scream coming out in February, for example. We have a very good relationship with Paramount. There are 4 examples of there's gun usage. There are 4 examples of gun safety in the movie. Right. So I'm sure everybody in your audience has seen the first 6 Screams. This is the 7th one that's coming out.
Absolutely.
All of them. This is the 7th one that's coming out in February. And there's a scene, not giving too much away, where a character's in a car and has to get the gun in the car. The gun is in a safe in the car. That would not have happened but for Brady's involvement in talking about this. So that is what, there are other ways to measure this, but that is one way, is actually seeing it on screen. Now, we do watch a lot of TV and movies. We don't see everything. So we ask people to tell us, let us know when they see stuff as well. So I'd ask that of your audience too. If you see stuff, we can't watch everything. So my family would get very mad at me if I sat in front of the TV all day. So please let us know. We're happy to hear about it.
And I will add to that, one of the challenges that we are experiencing now that our predecessors 30 years ago did not experience is back in the olden days, everyone watched the same things,
Yeah.
right? So it was very easy, I wouldn't say easy, it was easier to get the term designated driver into the American public because they put it on LA Law, Hill Street Blues, and Cheers. You probably hit 3/4 of America with that. So you just have to go a lot wider with this messaging and really hit 25 shows as opposed to 3, and that even might be being generous. It's much harder to have these cultural touchstone moments that I feel like speaks to a larger issue of how we unite our country. And it used to be that everybody would be sitting home watching the Sopranos season finale at the same time, right? And we'd have water cooler conversations and there were things that we could connect over. And I think in a time where the country is struggling to come together, and they're not those common moments that have nothing to do with politics. Sometimes film and television, there's still those like rare moments that can really connect us. And it's, I think, a beautiful thing when it does.
Yeah, and Erica, I would add, I love the question because when we talk about these types of big culture changes, they take a long time, right? And we can't wait until we see the end result to say whether something has worked. So I really appreciate the answer from Dori and Mathew. But we have to think about how culture change happens and what kind of shifts exist. There's this great academic, Damon Centola, who's a network sociologist who looks at how these things spread, and he tries to his big soapbox is to get people away from the idea of everything spreading like a virus. Not everything is viral. When you want social change, that is a complex contagion. And you want to think very clearly about how things are amplified, how many times, but also from what angles. If we had 25 touch points from shows that are coded in a lot of people's minds as highly progressive, we may be sending a different message, right? But if we are trying to figure out ways of getting that message visible to people from a lot of different quarters, then we're building this idea of a much larger social contagion that can start changing the culture in a really meaningful way. And those are the kind of metrics that tell us we're on the right track.
And I want to give one more example to something that Dori said, Erica, which was when we talk about NTI, nuclear threat initiative, somebody may say, well, you bring it up with these people, you talk about it. There was a show 24. Some of you remember 24, right? And there was an episode where they drop a nuclear bomb, like in Los Angeles. And then the next episode, Jack Bauer is driving around Los Angeles as if nothing ever happened. That's the exact thing that we do not want to see. So Dori and I go in this phase where they're early on, often in a production, sometimes it's later. And we talk about the reality of what people need to see. And I will say, and I think it's interesting for your audience, is that about a year ago, I don't think this was getting a ton of traction. But now it's a much different situation in the nuclear space in terms of how people are thinking of it, as a lot of countries talk about building nuclear weapons, as people threatened, like Russia threatened to use tactical nuclear weapons, as we bomb a facility in Iran. People are thinking about this as House of Dynamite comes out, as Jim Cameron does this for his next movie. People are talking about this much more. That makes, by the way, it makes it a little easier for Dori and I to get into the room. Now that people are talking about this, it makes it a little bit easier.
Yeah, and also Omar, thank you for that. I love that the idea of how we think about what type of contagion this is, right? And what culture change actually looks like, and that it isn't just this kind of one way, this one moment when then everything spreads, but that it's various touch points. And that speaks to actually one of the questions, a couple of questions actually that already came in. But one participant said that a lot of these seem to be aimed more at progressive audience. How do we reach out to the movable or confused middle? And this is partially a strategic question, right? So from the left, who do we need to talk to and how? But from a practical question around your work, how do you all think about the audiences that need to be reached, right? Is it preaching to the choir particularly effective? When is it? How do you decide that? And how does that play into thinking about larger cultural shifts? And anyone, Omar, maybe since you brought up the contagion idea, and I know some of the things you were talking about in your beginning.
I'm happy to jump in, and I'm actually going to cite my fellow presenters here because I thought the point on gun safety got to this, right? It's not it wasn't a mission to try to get people to not buy guns. It's recognizing that many millions of Americans have them, and the issue that resonates with people across the political spectrum is you got to use your gun safely, and store them safely. So I think it's understanding what the right message is that can move people across the political spectrum, getting it in front of them in media that or even social media or other sources that reach audiences that we're trying to reach. We have to be very careful about that, and also understand who the messenger is. Who's I'm going to get out of my lane here, but I'm going to hopefully say this right. But like, who's the character that's doing the thing in the show or the film matters, right? Who's the messenger saying the point matters. So being very thoughtful about that and how you're building a broader network map to make sure you're showing a variety of diverse voices for that kind of social change is really important.
Yep.
So that's exactly right, Omar. So just using a couple of examples. So first of all, we do things like, you saw those images of Stephen Miller being kind of mocked, right? So that Hollywood is probably considered pretty progressive. People are very happy when we email them and say, can you do this? Writers are very happy to get involved in this one. So that's just mockery that can go viral, Omar. Separately, though, on the gun thing, a perfect example would be the show Tulsa King, which is in the Taylor Sheridan universe of shows, right? So you all know Yellowstone. Tulsa King is the Stallone show that takes place in Oklahoma. Stallone is not a rabid left-winger. That show did the best example of show gun safety of any show. They did 2.5 minutes where Stallone's daughter, her character on the show, not his actual daughter, and her boyfriend gives her a gun and teaches her about show gun safety with a safe, has her use the gun, asks her if it's loaded or not. She gets the answer wrong. He says, "You won't believe how many stupid people accidentally kill somebody, not realizing that their gun is loaded." We could not do better than that, right? That goes to an audience that we need to reach. Zoe Saldana on Lioness, there's a lot of shooting on that show. Again, Taylor Sheridan Universal shows. When she goes home, she puts her gun in a safe. The Bad Boys movie, a lot of shooting in the Bad Boys movie. Military character, there's a guy, former military, when he's at home and they're being attacked, he pulls his gun out of a safe, right? So it's all these different types of audiences. Everybody sees it. The ideas develop some ubiquity. That's if we're trying to move everybody, right, on the gun issue. But we do also do other things that are more specific, like the mockery of Stephen Miller or something like that. That also is, it's utilizing people in a way that we get asked. Let me just say this: we get asked, Eric and Omar, for things that we don't think are a good idea. Like I just got a big ask from somebody who's a non-entertainment industry writer to do a whole program involving the entertainment industry and elected leaders. It would be a horrible use of everybody's time. Their backlash would be terrific. So we say no, and we say no a lot.
Got it, which is good, a good thing. So we only have a few minutes left. I want to talk a little bit the kind of categories of questions that remain. One is about, and I think you all have alluded to this already, other platforms, other places where audiences are absorbing these messages. I think social media has come up a couple times in the questions. And so I want to quickly touch on that. And then the thing I'd like to close with is there are a lot of folks on right now who appreciate these strategies, but may be working for smaller organizations, may not be working with national organizations, but are working on really, really important causes. The question is, how do we do this type of culture change work outside of Hollywood or outside of already having some of these relationships and connections? So Dori, maybe if you want to touch on the other audiences, since I thought that was a nice question after you shared how different our kind of content consumption habits are these days.
Yeah, I mean, I think about culture can mean a lot of different things, right? So on a national, global level, it's, film and television and social media. If you want to talk about culture work using a different definition of culture on a smaller scale, I always, and this might be taking a left turn, but never underestimate the power of the youth sports coaches. When I think about when you're trying to mobilize towns and communities to vote certain ways and to get out the vote, it is those sports games that I think have a lot of traction, there's a lot of town leaders and community leaders and senior roles there. And I think going through those folks and educating them and letting that natural trickle down effect really matters. And I think it doesn't need to be done on such a huge scale and try and get millions of eyeballs at once. A lot of this work, it's groundwork, it's door-to-door work. It's the reason canvassing, and we are still in the year 2025 knocking on doors, like the most Flintstonian of things to do, still works, right? So it's like really looking at it granularly, and those sports leaders in these small towns or in these big cities that are not, the big national cities, I think really make a difference.
That's great. It's great to think about. It's great to think about that and remind ourselves that culture is not, again, just top down. It is not just large scale movies and televisions. And in fact, a lot of the culture change that we see happening, particularly with younger folks, is not originating there, right? And mainstream kind of television and media oftentimes is following trends that have originated and are born from social media and from the ground up. And from conversations that are happening in real life. Before we get to that last question that I mentioned, there was another one that came in. And it was specifically about, I alluded to this a little bit, that like if we all on this call understand the importance, how do we get the people with the money who can help us make this work happen? How do we convince them? So one question was, how do we get donors in our politics who are focused on that short term, on the next election, How do we get them invested in the strategy for culture shift, right? What does that look like? And are you seeing any traction in this direction? So who of you is engaging regularly with donors and can kind of speak to what you're seeing and hearing and what might be effective there?
You want to try
Yeah.
that one first,
Oh, go ahead, Mathew.
Dori?
You get it.
Yeah, go for it.
You want me to go?
Yeah.
So Dori and I are not generally, except for Brady, we're not generally fundraisers. But for example, there's a foundation that contacted us because the head of the foundation wants to fight fascism in the United States. So they've asked us for recommendations for where to put their money, right? So we're able to make those types of recommendations. They're pretty large donations that they're giving out for where to put their money on the basis of who's doing good work. That's a really long-term project. The donors, yes, donors think very short term. And a lot of the stuff that donors do, if you ask us, are a mistake. There are a lot of these, by the way, how many Project 2029 type things are there right now? Most of them are very backwards looking at 2024 instead of trying to figure out what we're really going to be doing in 2029. So a lot of it, it's not easy. Donors don't necessarily always want you to be honest with them. Right, because they want to give to the candidates that, do you remember the example of Amy McGrath, who I know is running for office again, who was down lost to Mitch McConnell by like 412 points, I think, I'm not exactly. But she got $1 bazillion. The same thing with the candidate who ran against Marjorie Taylor Greene, Marcus Flowers. He lost by $1 bazillion points. Don't waste your money on these people just to make yourselves feel better. There are plenty of candidates that are close. There are plenty of causes that are important. So it's not just, Erica, when we ask people to donate, and we do, it's not just for cultural things. It's for candidates as well, but we try to take a very long-term view of it and say, this is what's important. Don't just donate because you hate Mitch McConnell, right? And when we talk about causes, we're involved or have friends involved in immigration issues, for example, we try to be very careful about what we're recommending and where that money is going. So I'd only say, we don't talk to every donor, but part of the purpose of our Zooms is to guide people as to where their money goes. No one has to give money in this group, but they host fundraisers.
Right.
So we try to make sure that when people come onto those groups on all of these causes that you may care about, they really understand where that money is going and what those causes are. And none of those causes are a Project 2029 type thing. I love the House Majority PAC, for example. People should give to the House Majority PAC. Some of those things are great, but we are very careful about where we ask people to put their money. If you have ideas, feel free to send them and we can take a look at it.
And Erica,
Right.
just to expand on the question just for one sec, I feel that so much of the culture work intentionally is under the radar, that people don't realize that we're doing it. That's why it's successful. But then that makes it harder for donors to want to get excited about it because they're not realizing it's happening. The last thing in the world we want is for a bunch of Hollywood elites to be telling you what to do with your body, with your guns, with your everything, right? We don't need their opinion. But this one,
go ahead.
No, jump in.
We got asked one time to fly dozens of Hollywood people to a state. Somebody said, I'll send a private plane, put you up in a hotel at the end of a campaign. And we said, do you want a bunch of assholes from Hollywood the weekend before this election? No, these people are adults. They could take care of themselves. Don't do that. Like, it just looks bad.
Right.
So
Let me add a
shedding
couple of
light on-
thoughts if I can.
Yes, go,
Please,
Omar.
Omar.
Yeah, no. So just, first off, I get the especially in this moment, the appeal of giving to candidates and feeling like you're doing something right now because things feel bad. But it's an all of the above strategy. And we have so many cycles now where we're seeing that just investing in these short-term tactics is not enough. And I think donors are getting wise to it. And also the frame matters. A lot of these donors have funds to give out because they're smart in investment and business, and they know how to think about the long term. They just need to apply that frame to a lot of this work. But the last thing I'll say is that on culture, it is not a light switch. It's not like we do all this work and then suddenly it gets turned on and everything's fine. It is progressively making the environment better. And there are short-term benefits that continue to accrue over time, but it is not something that has only payout 20, 25 years from now. The payout's immediate.
I mean, I think what Mathew and Dori are doing, it's short-term benefits, but you're creating a long-term change. And understanding that, and donors understanding that, is really, really important and one of the challenges I think we all face.
Yeah. And just to kind of bring us home and make sure that I'm lifting up the number of questions that came in about how do we do this at the local level? How do we do this in smaller organizations? I think the points that have been made about that culture is bigger than just television, than just movies, that this is really about the air that we breathe. What are people consuming? And I use that word broadly. What are people consuming and engaging with and coming into contact with that is changing how they see themselves, how they see their neighbors, how they see the world around them. And so when you broaden the definition that way, even as smaller organizations, there is access to those things, whether it is partnering with local kind of influencers who are on social media, but who are based where you are, who care about those issues. You'd be surprised. I do a lot of work with influencers. They actually really do like doing stuff for where they're from and where they live. They don't all have to be, million plus followers. There are artists where you live who are eager to partner with organizations. And then there are other ways to then, depending upon what your issue area is, partner with larger national organizations who may have opportunities, resources, messengers who are willing to work on the issues that are most relevant to where you are. And so I love this conversation because it shows us what is possible. It shows us that whether we're talking about kind of broader values changes and narrative shifts, or we're talking about very specific policy issues and behavior change, even though these things take quite a while, it is possible for them to be effective and to be able to actually see changes in how people think, how people work, how people behave, and ultimately how people vote if we invest the time and the energy and the resources in doing that work now. So thank you, Omar. Thank you, Dori and Matt. And I will turn it over to you, Paige, to close us out.
This has been a great conversation, and I want to thank everybody who is on it. And this is the kind of work that is central, I think, to making sure that we bring our country back to a country that we recognize and love. And we love our country anyway, but it is a country that we want to recognize again, and a country that's, not punitive, and a country that celebrates each individual equally. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we thank
you.
Jeff Guerin for introducing us? Can we thank Jeff
Yes,
Guerin?
absolutely. Jeff Guerin, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.